This is a CBS New York special. Black history is our history.
It was called the Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad.
From a New York hideout for those desperately seeking freedom to a church built by former slaves, commemorating a past laden with injustice.
He had faced various issues, discrimination issues, Jim Crow type issues.
The courageous African Americans who broke barriers and opened doors. We remember their legacies.
To fling my arms wide.
I hope that the audience connects on a very visceral way.
Finding comfort and strength in one another.
African American fraternities and sororities are just as integral of the Black community as the Black church.
And knowing there's hope for the future for all of us.
My dream is just to inspire other people to use their talents to just change the world.
Good evening, I'm Dana Tyler. This Black History Month has been like no other. As we think about what happened in 2020, a year we saw so much American history in the making. For the first time in more than a century, the country was hit by a pandemic. On March 1st, the tri-state area's first confirmed case of the coronavirus was quickly followed by a devastating disproportionate impact on communities of color. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Black Americans are twice as likely to die from COVID-19 than whites. In late May, George Floyd, a 46-year-old African-American, died while being arrested in Minneapolis. A video showed a police officer kneeling on Floyd's neck as he repeatedly said, "I can't breathe." The outrage over Floyd's death triggered the large protests in the country against police brutality. There were cries of Black Lives Matter. Those cries echoed across the U.S. in a movement against racial injustice, a movement not seen since the civil rights protests of the 1960s. And in November, history at the polls. Americans elected Kamala Harris, the first woman of color, as Vice President of the United States. For the next hour on CBS New York, we recognize the many contributions of African Americans, present and past, starting with the man known as the father of Black history. Dr. Carter G. Woodson was born in Virginia in 1875 to former slaves. He became an accomplished scholar, prolific author, and a visionary. He created what we now celebrate as Negro History Month to right what he saw as the unacceptable wrong, the glaring omission of a formalized Negro history.
There was a time following slavery when society had developed a racial worldview, if you will, that African Americans did not possess a history and culture. And this view, therefore, distorted a lot of the conceptions of what the Black race was in terms of their capabilities and talents and everything that they might have offered to American history.
In 1926, Dr. Woodson started Negro History Week in February, an observance which would later be expanded to a month.
Now, the misnomer is that because it's the shortest month of the year, it must have been given to us. Actually, Woodson chose this month because it was the month for the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, February 12th and February 14th, respectively.
Dr. Woodson founded what is now known as the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Dr. Deidre Foreman is the president of the association's Manhattan branch, and she says Woodson's goals went far beyond documenting Black heritage.
He and others noticed that there was a significant disparity in the educational system in the United States.
Carter Woodson overcame that disparity and in 1912 became the second Black person to earn a Ph.D. from Harvard University and the first whose parents were slaves. Woodson's most well-known book, The Miseducation of the Negro, is still studied in classrooms. First published in 1933, it examines the failures of how Black people were taught and how Blacks were conditioned to be less, to be subservient.
Woodson became a strong proponent for educating the masses, specifically the white population due to the discrimination and racist atrocities that have been taking place.
Dominique Jean-Louis is the assistant curator of history exhibitions at the New York Historical Society.
So much of what Carter G. Woodson wanted to do was really examine closely what we're taught in schools and how that affects our mindsets moving forward. And so I think museums can be another way to do that.
The Historical Society's landmark exhibitions have included a three-part exhibit called Slavery in New York and Works of the Harlem Renaissance. Jean-Louis says cultural institutions are vital to preserve and further the legacy of the history and culture of African Americans.
Carter G. Woodson is kind of part of this cadre of thinkers, scholars, intellectuals who are really pushing the boundaries of what it means to theorize African-American life and what it means to celebrate the history that had happened up until that point. So his connection to Harlem and to New York is really an intellectual one, as well as a social one.
Arturo Alfonso Schomburg was a Woodson contemporary and a passionate contributor to the Harlem Renaissance. His vast personal collection of documenting Black history established what we know as the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture.
I think what Carter G. Woodson and what Schomburg did, and kind of all of these early advocates of Black history and Black scholarship did, was really lay the groundwork for some of these future Black studies departments and make it acceptable to study yourself.
Joy Bivens is the Associate Director of Collections and Information Services at the Schomburg Center, which is recognized worldwide for its vast collection.
You know, at the Schomburg, Black History Month is every month. We do this all the time, right? And the riches and unbelievable and undeniable contributions that Black people have made to world history are represented in our collections, are represented through the books that we have, represented through our programs. So I would say that Carter G. Woodson, Negro History Week, all of these were outgrowths of an explosion of interest, of the knowledge that this information needed to be out there, and it needed to be promoted as widely to Black people as possible.
Dr. Woodson died in 1950. President Gerald Ford proclaimed February Black History Month 26 years later, the observance addressing centuries of oppression, systemic racism, and celebrating African Americans' countless contributions to art and culture.
Black history is American history, and American history is Black history. You can't have one without the other.
Dr. Dwight Mcbride became president of the New School 9 months ago, bringing a deep academic resume of African American studies.
And if you're going to tell a story of America and leave out Black people, it's going to be a very incomplete, not to mention unsatisfying and dishonest stories.
He says he's fortunate to lead the university, especially now, after the brutal deaths of George Floyd and other African Americans, and the massive protests and civil unrest. This awakening for American society, Dr. Mcbride says, is a critical opportunity.
I think Black history, the study of it and the way it happens, not only in schools, but in churches, but now in municipalities, right, in states, in organizations, in corporations. I think that's critically important to creating a more inclusive world, because every successive generation always has the fear, right, I think, of losing or forgetting the importance of our history. And we've seen, if nothing else, we've seen in recent years what can happen when we neglect and forget our history, right? How dangerous that can be.
One of Dr. Carter G. Woodson's noted supporters was civil rights activist and historian W.E.B. Du Bois. He was the first African-American to earn a Ph.D. from Harvard University. Much has been written about the Underground Railroad, a network through more than a dozen states of secret routes and safe houses to help people trying to escape slavery. As CBS 2's Vanessa Murdock reports, New York was a gateway.
New York Harbor in the 19th century hosted ships billowing with goods harvested on the backs of enslaved people.
It is a city that is founded upon capitalism, and it's specifically that cotton and sugar industry.
Historian and educator Preeti Kanakamatala tells us even after slavery formally ends in New York State in 1827, the economy in the city remained rooted in the practice. At the same time, a small number of abolitionists organized and helped enslaved people find their way to freedom.
This was black and white people cooperating with each other. That doesn't always happen in American history.
Eric Foner, historian and author of Tells Us the Underground Railroad flourished in the 1850s. The number of people seeking freedom nearly tripled.
I think it's important to note that the vast majority of people on the Underground Railroad helping out and the abolitionists were African Americans, but they had some very important allies.
Allies with money, influence, and visibility, says Stacy Toussaint, president of Inside Out Tours. We met her at Plymouth Church in Brooklyn Heights.
It was called the Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad. That is because the pastor of the church, Henry Ward Beecher, hid people in the basement of this church.
Not just that, he hosted auctions.
He would bring enslaved people from other parts of the country here so that the congregation could raise money to set that person free.
Plymouth Church, just one of many sites around the city that can trace their heritage back to abolitionist activity, and one of the few still standing. Another in Manhattan, 337 and 339 West 29th Street in Chelsea, belonged to James Gibbons and Abby Hopper Gibbons.
It's a living, standing symbol. The fact that New York City is part of this feature of the anti-slavery struggle.
Foner describes the Gibbons as radical Quakers and courageous, offered temporary shelter to those considered fugitive slaves. The Gibbons and their home so well known for abolitionist activity that an angry mob attacked during the draft riots in 1863. This La Colombe coffee shop at 36 Lispenard Street in Tribeca stands where David Ruggles' home once stood. Today, only a plaque reminds us history happened here. Ruggles, a free black man who moved to New York City in the 1820s, was a writer, editor, owner of a newspaper, and a staunch abolitionist.
Here was this man attempting to really push the envelope of democracy and make sure that people could have a fresh start, find a job, find a home.
His home offered safe passage to more than 600 people. One of those, Frederick Bailey Better, known today as activist and author Frederick Douglass. Douglass wrote, "I became relieved from it by the humane hand of David Ruggles, whose vigilance, kindness, and perseverance I shall never forget." Vanessa Murdock, CBS 2 News.
The desperation to reach freedom and the abolitionists who made it possible. Coming up, a look inside the basement of Plymouth Church, walking in the footsteps of the freedom seekers. And as the nation confronts its history of racial inequality, there's a push to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. Also, we have art with a message.
With a smile so dope and a jaw so stone, she crack rock.
We'll meet young poets using spoken word to inspire social change. And as we go to break, paying tribute to some African-American inventors. Lewis Latimer, the son of fugitive slaves, invented a method for producing a longer-lasting light bulb, which also made lighting affordable for more people. He lived in Queens when he died in 1928. You can visit the Lewis Latimer House Museum. We have the information on our website, cbsnewyork.com. We'll be right back.